The releases are here, the opinions are out. Let's talk about the new models from Rolex and Tudor. I've deliberately titled this video Oddly Satisfying. Odd because many of these models are peculiar, and satisfying because a few of my ideas and concepts shared across us as creatives seemed to have materialized in one way or another. Some of these ideas even dating back as far as 3 years ago. What are the reactions to these releases? Well, mixed as always. I'm sure many others are feeling quite lukewarm. And I look at these watches and feel quite optimistic. And this is because we are seeing these two brands operate differently to how they normally do. One is taking the risk, the other not so much. The main flagships of this release all represent something different. And I hope to expand upon all of these and discuss the niches that they all belong to. The theme this year was sky and navigation. And we see it when we look to the GMT, we look to the Air King, we look across to Tudor, we see something similar in the sake of a GMT Explorer style model. Let's begin with Rolex and talk about the head scratcher, the Destro GMT. What are we calling this watch? The Sparletta, the Cream Soda, the Green Lantern, the Green Arrow, the Sprite, the Frankenstein? No idea. Before discussing this design in depth, let's roll the predictions video from a few months back. Let's throw something wild out there and say instead of the Hulk Submariner being re-released, which I don't think is very likely, what about just injecting some green into the GMT line? They've done this before with the very first ceramic model. Why not use the green hand and match with a contrasting green subsection to the bezel? Call this watch the Green Lantern. Now, I'm not particularly a fan of how Rolex uses green on their sports models, but this configuration, I think, not only debuting the increase in size, would stand head and shoulders above the other models. It's just the right amount of character, the right amount of vibrance to look interesting. Maybe it's not going to be something we see now, even though green is still in vogue, but maybe soon. I can't believe I got it right. It was a complete fluke. And I said something in the video that the color green is almost going to be an inevitable choice down the line. Whether now or in the future, it's still in vogue, it's still popular, but it's going to be a part of the GMT one day soon. Not only have they given this watch the green arrow hand, but they've also allocated half of the bezel. Very briefly, Destro, meaning right-handed. If we are to look at this watch and discuss how it was formulated and thought through, a designer could have quite literally just pressed Ctrl-T to transform it, reflected it across the vertical axis, and there is your answer. This watch is a pure mirror image of your standard GMT that you look at, and there is a lot to discuss around this theme and why they did it. The purist could say that it is a callback to past references, a very small number of watches that had a similar style. An early example of this was the 6542. But in most instances, this format, this aesthetic of the Destro case, is normally given and issued with military pieces, provided on watches that have larger than average crowns or crown guard systems. This, in a way, allows for the crown not to dig into the hand of the wearer. It also keeps it out of harm's way, and also opens creative opportunity for this larger crown system to be explored. A very popular example of this is the Omega Ploprof. More recently today is the Tudor Pelagos LHD. Are there any benefits with this configuration? Not really. It's a design that was made to cater for that 10% of wearers who have watches on their right wrists. And I'm sure many other left-handers will concur that very often when they're setting the time or winding the watch, they rotate it so that the crown is the other way around. This format is simply for those who are left-handed and or wear watches on their right wrist. There is no other true practical benefit to this design. So why did they do it? I think that's the big question that a lot of people have on their minds. I believe it was a design made to upset, made to not appeal to the masses. The crown on the left-hand side already only appeals to a small percentage. But by flipping the date window and also having it next to the crown, it throws off the dimension of the watch completely. As some have rightly said, having the date window near the crown means that when you roll the sleeve back, the date is the first thing you see if you're wearing the watch on the right wrist. A watch like this, in a way, has two results. One end, it doesn't make it as appealing anymore because not everyone can wear it. Since it's a new GMT that's introduced in green, we know how popular the color green is. This watch in its standard configuration would have appealed to many buyers. So I feel in some way that this was done to quell the overarching hype that belongs to the Hulk, the Cermet Submariners, and all of those models. On the flip side of that, it's going to be greatly appealing and collectible because it's the only left-hand drive watch that Rolex currently makes. It's the first. It's the resurgence of a green GMT hand that we haven't seen for a long time. Sad to say, as a left-hander who wears watches on his right hand, I don't think 90% of these watches will ever see a wrist. These watches will be bought, put into a safe, never to see the light of day. That's purely because of speculation, because they are unique. And if we look at Rolex's track record, the ugly ducklings are usually the ones that always become greatly collectible. The sad reality of a brand who tries anything to deter the hoarders, the grey market flippers, they won't be able to quell the interest. Aesthetically, when I look at this watch, I don't appreciate the way that the crown and the date has been arranged. I know it's a pure mirror image, but I think the greatest shortcoming with this design is that they did too much at once. If the case was flipped around and the date remained at the 3 o'clock position, I believe it would have a far greater appeal. And if I was someone who wanted to get a left-hand drive, this is the aesthetic that I would have preferred. And I think a lot of wearers would concur that having the date window across from the crown would create some kind of balance to the asymmetry, and just on the whole look far more aesthetically pleasing. Still, the result is good. I think the formal use of colors looks fantastic, and I also think, sadly, that this model is going to be the greatest safe queen from Rolex of all time. The updated Air King was a great surprise. I don't think any of us expected. If we roll the predictions clip again, first off, we need to talk about the watches that might be discontinued. The Yachtmaster 2, the Milgauss, the Air King. I think if any of these watches or all of these watches go, it won't be a surprise. They've been around for a very long time, and their day is soon to come. Most of us expected this watch to be discontinued, but as a final swan song, a final hurrah, we now see the Air King professionalized. It's been given crown guards and the applied Arabics are now fully loomed. Cut it as thin as you like, I see this as a stock clearance exercise. This is quite literally the last of the Air King. And it is a good looking model. But if we think back to its origins and its history of being given to RAF pilots during the 40s and the 50s, it was a piece designed for aviation, designed for navigation. The question is, when you look to the aesthetic and design of this watch, does it scream navigator's instrument to you? This configuration, in a way, does allow you to appreciate the older generation with the solid gold surrounds, with the solid white gold Arabics instead of the fully loomed elements. I say that because when I look at this watch now, I see clutter. I see an entire arrangement of numerals of different sized fonts, 5 lines of text, the inclusion of crown guards. It just looks busy. It looks too busy. It feels like this design, instead of being refined, has just been piled on with more features. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, who doesn't want more? But when you view it in its entirety, you look at it as a professional instrument, there is a small adjustment that can be made to make it far more appealing. I believe that when approaching a design like this, there should be a cardinal rule that when numbers are involved in a design, that there should also be an equal or opposite counter in the form of batons and plots. What we see here when we look to the Air King is excess, number clutter. Does this present to you as a pilot's watch or a navigational instrument, or could it be made with more clarity? So I took inspiration from Rolex professional models, from pilot watches, more specifically the IWC Mark 11, a legendary pilot watch that essentially pioneered the effectiveness of British field watches in years to come. What made the IWC Mark 11 stand out so brilliantly were those quarter plots. So all I've done in this example is remove the Arabic numerals, replace them with batons. You now have a clear dividing line between the numerals and the plots on the dial. The batons break up the numeral busyness on the dial and allows it to breathe more. Also gives the watch, in my opinion, a more air navigational aesthetic. The crosshair configuration then tied with the numerals set on the dial. If this was the true style, aesthetic that we were given, crown guards, quarter batons to divide the dial with numerals surrounding it. In my humble opinion, I would have called this the perfect Air King, the perfect send-off to this watch. It's also just good to see that they've adjusted the 5 on the dial, because this was a complaint, an adjustment I made to this watch 3 years ago, April 2019. So it's clear that Rolex does listen to us as a community, listens to those complaints behind the scenes. I think the Air King is a great looking watch. I think it's one that you should definitely consider, especially because it offers so many things that none of the other professional models add. Now having crown guards, but even still it's a model that also has a yellow coronet, green Rolex logo, green hand. Fully applied numerals that are now loomed. It always has been and will always be a head scratcher, and I think that's a good thing. Surprisingly, one watch that has not been a part of this new launch, that was adjusted behind the scenes, definitely did not receive the limelight, is the Sea Dweller 44, or the Deepsea. They have sculpted and have streamlined this watch better than they have ever before. Not only the black dial, which I believe is a recreation of the original Deepsea that came out in 2012, but also the James Cameron variant. It looks like they've tapered the lugs, they've adjusted the crown guards, giving it a much better fluid look, paired then with the wider bracelet. It is a knockout piece, and I'm surprised not many more people are talking about it. I think this is the best that the Deepsea has ever looked. And then finally, a watch of note is the Yachtmaster 42. Here I was saying that I expected to see it in titanium. That didn't happen, unfortunately. But I did say at one stage that the 42mm in white gold is woefully underappreciated, and it's a model that's been left on the wayside. Well, in order to inject some new life into the line, they've introduced it in yellow gold. The Yachtmaster 42's proportions are spot on. They've scaled everything correctly, and funny enough, it's one of the designs they offer that hasn't changed much over the years. Where so many of the other professional models have seen these minor tweaks and phase changes, the Yachtmaster has remained relatively the same. But Rolex did it so right when they scaled it to 42 and scaled everything else proportionally. The batons, the plots, the handset, the scale of the bezel insert, it all looks correct. Strange releases from the Rolex brand, and I like the fact that these took a risk. If we navigate ourselves across to Tudor, the headline release, the Black Bay Pro. And one final time, let's roll the predictions video again. Instead of following the traditional Black Bay line, what they could do instead is look even further back in their catalog and try and cross-amalgamate bits and pieces to create a GMT model that is more faithful to the 1655. This is something I have asked for again and again. I think this is the third year in a row. Now, why do I think that it is possible this year? Well, over the course of last year, we saw the Explorer and Explorer 2 receive a facelift. Maybe releasing in tandem, we see the same thing happen with Tudor. Tudor will reinterpret and create a watch that pays tribute to the Explorer 2, and realistically, it's not a lot of work to be done. It's a simple exercise, and the result would be excellent. The Black Bay Pro as a model is a great step forward. Unfortunately, I believe this is as far as we will ever get to seeing a 1655 recreation. And when we look to the overarching aesthetic, we see that it is most definitely a Black Bay, but it's also pulling inspiration from the Ranger collection and more specifically the North Flag. They are definitely looking back to those earlier models. And this can be said when we look to the color palette chosen, a bright, almost luminescent orange-yellow. Now the inspirations tied to the 1655 GMT, they're all there. Fixed bezel insert, steel, even the typeface looks kind of similar, plus the orange hand. Another step forward to say that this is a 58 model is that it's 39mm in diameter. It uses the same in-house GMT movement, the MT5652. The feature that I think is going to be grabbing a lot of attention is the T-fit clasp. These watches now have a micro-adjust system that doesn't require spring bars and pins. And I think this clasp and bracelet is going to slowly but surely work its way into the Black Bay line. The one unit of measurement that has come to define this watch is its thickness. 14.6mm. So you're dealing with a watch that's 39 in diameter, 47 when we look to the overall lug-to-lug distance, and 14.6 in thickness. This watch is going to wear tall on the wrist, and the slab side case continues. This is something I addressed a few weeks back, discussing the Black Bay 58 and why I believe it would be a game changer. Until they adjust the movement on this watch, the thickness is going to remain relatively the same. But moving all of that aside, does a watch like this make for a great everyday travel companion? And I think the answer is yes. With a fixed steel bezel that doesn't look like your typical Black Bay diver. It has this strange cream paint application on all the plots on the handset. You notice that the quarter batons have been shifted further to the edge of the dial, and the triangle at the 12 has been given the same treatment. Once again, there are lots of quirks to this design, but I think it plays in the watch's favor. It's Tudor, almost putting their toe into the pool and feeling what the temperature is going to be like. So on one hand, where I can appreciate this watch as pulling inspiration from a classic Rolex GMT, I don't like the fact that it still looks like a Black Bay. If I was given creative control of this model and its new release, I would have debuted it under the newly reformed Ranger line. I would be using the same dimensions, a 39mm case, but also giving it crown guards. And all I would simply do is give it a snowflake dial, enlarge all the plots, stretch the batons at the quarters and make them look bigger. Take the triangle at the 12 o'clock position and stretch it all the way down so it almost touches the shield. And then for an added attention to detail, apply a small marker next to the date window. I believe a design like this would be much more true to Tudor and its aesthetic, while at the same time giving you a more literal interpretation of what the 1655 would look like without compromising the watch's aesthetic. It would show that Tudor is brave enough to debut a snowflake hand with a snowflake dial. If we look to the Pelagos line, it's one of their most successful watches for a reason. And I believe a format like this would appeal not only to the enthusiast, but also the first-time watch buyer. You know, it takes away the softness of the rounded aesthetics and gives you a harder, more aggressive outlook. This piece, I believe, would speak a lot more to the tool watch nature that belongs to the steel bezel. But that's my 2 cents. I love the fact that this watch now exists, and it is the right step forward. It's the curse of being a designer that you end up falling in love with your own work. And for someone who has a great passion for vintage watches and the details, these are the kinds of elements that I would want to inject into a new design like this. Now, next to the Black Bay Pro, we also saw a new steel and gold root beer GMT. The colors definitely correspond very nicely, and I think a lot of people will be interested in this watch, especially when we look at its price point next to its Rolex companion. And then next to it, the Black Bay chronograph saw an adjustment of a gold dial with black subdials. Nothing too monumental when we look at these two-tone models, but they do add to the arsenal. And with these pieces, it's good to see that value proposition with two-tone. But those were the primary releases from Rolex and Tudor. And again, referring back to oddly satisfying, you might have noticed that with all of the main flagship releases, I have adjusted them in one way or another. Does that mean that these designs could have been better, or am I just overreaching? That's up to you. Safe to say that these releases haven't received the explosion of fireworks like they usually do. But these odd designs, these strange ones, allow us to interpret them differently. It's great to see that people are forming opinions around the designs of watches and questioning whether or not they're good, and where these watches can fit into different lifestyles, belong on different wrists. Having designs that are inclusive, that are head-scratching, that are strange. A fun series of watches that for a change don't follow templates that aren't cookie cutter in design. I'm all for it.